Greetings, psychology students. In this clip, I'm going to cover some practical examples of how to respond to classical conditioning scenarios on exams and potentially SACs. So before we get into the three past exam questions that I will cover on this clip, let's just place a degree of emphasis on the key aspects of each of the three stages of CC. So before conditioning, the two stimuli at this stage are separate. There's no association. That comes later on. The UCS will naturally elicit a UCR, and the UCR must be involuntary so that we are showing the examiner we know the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. At this stage, the NS does not elicit a desirable or undesirable response. Again, that comes later on. Now we get to the money stage. Historically, this is where students lose the bulk of their marks for a lack of detail, a lack of precision in their responses, and simply not following the key principles of classical conditioning. So again, points of emphasis. The NS and the UCS must be repeatedly paired. The NS must always be first, and the UCS is obviously second, and they must be paired closely together, otherwise no association will be made. So three key points: repetition, the NS is always first, then UCS, and they've got to closely follow one another so that association can be made. Now we get to the final stage. If we can present the CS on its own without the UCS and it reflexively elicits a CR, then we know the conditioning has been successful. Okay, let's go through the first of three past exam questions from 216, this first one. So Katrina's eating toast for brekkie every day, 3 days in a row. The toaster's got stuck in the toaster and burned. It set off a smoke alarm that's made a high-pitched noise, caused the dog to be startled and run away. Now, whenever Katrina uses the toaster, Buster the dog runs outside and hides in the garden. This question's asking for the terminology of classical conditioning. So that means we've got to identify the 5 elements, the 3 types of stimuli and the 2 types of responses. So let's unpack the question before we structure it with the actual guide. So first of all, if we look in the middle of the question, we've got a high-pitched noise. So that's our UCS, because it later then says in the same sentence that the dogs cause the dog to be startled and then run away. So that is our UCR. All right, that UCS has reflexively triggered that UCR. That's occurred naturally. Then when we get to the back end of the question, it says now whenever, let's change colors here, Katrina uses the toaster, so that's now a CS, causes Buster to run outside and hide in the garden. So that's our CR. Now you might be going, well, where's the NS? So just remember that the NS and the CS are the same. One's before conditioning, one's post conditioning. So here's our template. Our NS triggers no response. That's separate from the UCS, which will trigger a UCR. Then we get to stage 2. The NS and the UCS are repeatedly paired. And we must mention that the NS is first and then the UCS is second, and that will elicit a UCR. And then the CS on its own triggers a CR. Okay, so stage 1. The side of the toaster elicits no response. That's separate from the UCS, which is the high-pitched noise, which causes Buster to be startled and run away, the UCR. So they're separate. Then during conditioning, we've emphasized the fact there's repetition, 3 days in a row. We've emphasized the fact that there's close proximity between the alarm and seeing the toaster. And we've got our order in terms of we see the dog sees the toaster first, and then that's followed by the high-pitched noise. We're using the CC terminology, NS, paired with the UCS, which triggers the UCR. And then we get to the post-conditioning stage, and we're simply unpacking the terminology that's used in the back end of the question. There's no need to get creative here, just work with the scenario. So Buster is seeing Katrina using the toaster. We've pulled that right here. And what's the response? Running outside and hiding in the garden, because the dog has been conditioned based on those three pairings. Let's fast forward to 2021. Another dog scenario. So when Matilda takes Biscuit for their daily walk, they pass a house with a dog that barks. Biscuit becomes extremely excited and barks in response. After many months, Biscuit becomes excited and barks when they get near the house, even before Biscuit hears or sees the dog. So then we have the command terms of the question. So we've got to use the language of CC. We've got to take the three-phase approach. So we go to the middle part of the stem of the question. It says here, Biscuit becomes extremely excited and barks in response. So we know that that is a response. It says it in the question. That's a UCR. What triggered that? Well, basically going past a house with a dog that barks. Obviously, Biscuit loves other dogs. So there's a UCS. So then we get to the next sentence. Biscuit becomes excited and barks. So that's our CR. What causes the CR? Well, getting near the house, because Biscuit's anticipating that it's going to see the dog that basically gets it excited. Again, the CS was originally the NS prior to that repeated pairing. So potentially this is where we can pause the video, have a crack at this question using the template, adopting the same approach as the Buster question from 2016. So in terms of the solution guide here, the coloured parts are the points of emphasis in terms of the marking allocation. So in the first stage, the NS and the UCS are separate. We're using that CC terminology, seeing the house with the dog triggers no response. The sound of the barking is a UCS that reflexively elicits that excitement, UCR. And then when we get to the middle stage, the purple points are key. There's repetition. It's been going for many months. There's a order in terms of the NS first and then the UCS. And there's a close proximity in terms of the timing of the pairing. Then when we get to the post stage of conditioning, the NS is now the CS, because it's causing the barking in excitement in anticipation of seeing the dog, which is the CR. So in this final example that I'm going to go through, this question is a little alternative to the previous two, because if we look at the command terms in the second sentence, it merely asks us to outline the three-phase process of conditioning. It's not asking us to use the language of classical conditioning. I'm going to adapt this question, and so therefore we will identify the 5 elements, but we'll also touch on where the 4 marks were won and lost. So if we go to the start of the question, many species of birds can be conditioned to avoid predators. So that's our CR, and we're going to need to be a little bit creative in terms of our UCR, which we'll get to a bit later. It's asking us to pair the sound of the predator, so that's our NS, and our CS, before conditioning, post conditioning, with an unpleasant stimulus such as a puff of air, so that is our UCS, so that the birds can learn that the sound of the predator alone is dangerous. So we're going to need to be a little bit creative with our UCR. So the first mark for this question is simply to name the behaviourist approach to learning. There's 2 behaviourist approaches that we cover in our course, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So therefore this behaviourist approach is clearly classical conditioning based on the involuntary nature of the response, but you can pause the video and have a crack at the rest of the question if you would like. So 1 mark was awarded for simply stating it's the sound of the predator that elicits no response prior to that conditioning process. During the conditioning, again, there were marks awarded for emphasis on repetition and the close pairing of the NS and the UCS, not that we needed to use that language, so the sound of the predator and the puff of air are repeatedly paired, and that will trigger some type of fear response. And then we know that the conditioning has worked, and based on the objective of the conditioning process, that if the bird hears the sound of the predator alone, which would be a conditioned stimulus, that would trigger some type of avoidance response, which is the goal, so that basically the bird can escape the predator.